My life growing up was pretty unstable. I wanted so bad to have that nuclear family that I had lacked.
Brian Cargill is an architect in search of a wife and the white picket fence.
Kimberly was really beautiful and charismatic. I felt like, oh, she really gets me.
But when Kimberly turns into a human wrecking ball,
It's just out of nowhere. She just punched me in the face.
It's bad and evil. He was sleeping with the devil.
no one in Brian's life will be safe.
I took photographs of the abuse. We went into hiding immediately.
This body was so badly burned, they couldn't identify who it was.
She is one of the most vindictive, violent female psychopaths ever.
I was born in Wichita Falls, Texas. It was a great way to grow up, for sure. The adults are like, kids go outside, and so we just played in the barn where there's like big tractors and stuff. It was really fun. And my parents were married for about 3 years, and they got divorced. So my mom was pretty much a single mom, and she moved us around a lot.
As a boy, Brian Cargill's life is in constant motion.
I ended up going to probably 6 different elementary schools, probably 5 or 6 different junior highs, and 3 different high schools. It was pretty unstable most of the time.
Brian vows to build a secure future for himself. And when he graduates high school, he sets his sights on architecture.
I've always been very interested in buildings and structures and things like that. It just came so naturally to me. So by the time I got to graduation time, I already knew that I was going to go to architecture school.
By 1993, Brian is a 28-year-old architect living in Dallas. He's happily married, or so he thinks.
After a couple of years, my wife decided that she didn't want to be married anymore. And so I was just kind of left reeling. It was a big shock for me. At that point, my dreams had pretty much crumbled, and I was in an extremely vulnerable state. I just didn't know what to do with myself. I was just so distraught over this loss of kind of this idea of the nuclear family. That just seems like all I could think about.
9 months after the divorce is finalized, one of Brian's friends sets him up on a blind date.
He described her as very beautiful and very vivacious and intelligent, and he thought that we would be a good match.
Kimberly West is a 27-year-old receptionist.
We met, and I was very, very pleasantly surprised. She was really beautiful and just a very charismatic personality. She had just gotten divorced. She was in a custody situation with her ex. And so we kind of had some things in common. You know, we really hit it off.
Over the next several weeks, Brian and Kimberly start talking on the phone every day.
I felt like, oh, she really gets me. That she heard me, that she identified with me in a way that certainly my ex-wife had not done at all. It felt very romantic and just exciting. So it was great. Our second date was at a divorce support group at a church. And I got there a little early, and she was running late. Instead of waiting outside, I decided to just go ahead and go in. And so I sat down, and I kind of saved her a chair next to me. She finally came in, and she looked straight at me and kind of gave me a mean look. She sat in a different chair across the group from me. And so I was very kind of mystified as to, what was going on. After that, she really was mad at me because I had gone in ahead of her. She said, "This is my support group. You're my guest." It was just really kind of disproportionately angry about that. Then, just out of nowhere, she just held me back. It was kind of getting a little passionate. And then she just said, "I have to leave now." The whole thing left me feeling, this is a little weird. That whole second date was just strange.
As unnerving as the experience is, the next time Kimberly and Brian see each other, she acts as if nothing happened.
It started getting much more passionate. The chemistry between us was undeniable, and it was very powerful, and it was one that I'd not really experienced to that degree up until that point in my life. Kimberly was able to stir these feelings, in me, the passionate feelings, both physically and emotionally. I feel like I started falling in love with her pretty quickly, just because I did feel like this immediate, really strong connection.
Kimberly seems to be feeling the same way, because she treats Brian like he is a close, trusted companion.
Kimberly has a court date with her ex-husband, and he's going for full custody.
She wanted me to testify in court for her as a character witness. And at this point, I had known her for maybe 2 months. So I went to the courthouse with her, and when she was in the hearing, one of her friends gave me a copy of her psychological report. I read through the report, but so much of it, I didn't know what to make of it. Like, it had a lot of psychological terms that I wasn't familiar with, such as narcissism and borderline personality disorder.
Now, borderline personality disorder, that's the mother of all disorders. That's everything combined into one.
And individuals with borderline personality disorder have affective instability. They have emotions that are unstable. This is somebody who is highly impulsive, dramatic, has an intense fear of abandonment, and furthermore expresses typically some type of violence. It can be verbal aggression, physical aggression.
I was very conflicted about the whole report and wasn't sure what to make of it. She told me that her husband paid off psychologists to make fabricated psychological reports. But in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, this is a professional psychologist, and they don't just fabricate reports. And so I thought there was something there that I needed to be careful about.
The judge rules against Kimberly, and she is devastated. Brian feels for her and doesn't question her about the report.
I didn't want to have another failed relationship. In my previous marriage, I didn't get to fight for that relationship at all. So I didn't want to just walk away from the relationship, but kind of fight for it and do the best I possibly could to make it work.
The couple continue to see each other but live separately. Brian walks on eggshells to avoid Kimberly's bad temper.
If I said anything at all positive about my ex-wife, she would often jump all over that and say something pretty mean and nasty about her. Kimberly would often try to undermine my relationship with my ex-wife because she felt like it was threatening her relationship with me. Kimberly always could escalate, just acted very aggressively.
Really, what you have here is a powder keg. She's always exploding in this fit of rage if she doesn't get her way. She screams, she yells, it's my way or no way.
That was making me very unhappy. I started feeling that, okay, I don't think I need to be in this relationship. This relationship is starting to be something that's negative for me.
5 months into the relationship, Brian is ready to make a clean break.
We just had one fight too many, and I had finally solidified my resolve that I was going to break up. So I knew I was going to have this conversation with her. I'd kind of prepared for it mentally. I don't care what she says, I'm done with this. I was actually feeling pretty good about it. I was feeling a little bit of a sense of relief that I had kind of dodged a bullet. Okay, I'm going to put this behind me, just move on. I was about to say, all right, I'm done with this. I'm not seeing you anymore. Don't call me, etc. And that's when she told me she was pregnant.
I'm pregnant.
I felt like I was at the beginning of a horrible, horrible journey.
Just as Brian Cargill is about to break up with his girlfriend Kimberly, she tells him she is pregnant.
In that moment, my entire body just dropped, and it felt like kind of falling over a cliff. It's this flush of dread that just completely fills you and overwhelms you. But my first thought was, okay, we're gonna make this work. We're gonna take this curveball and we're gonna hit it out of the park. I mean, I'm not gonna walk away from a woman that is carrying my child. I'm just not gonna do that. And so I did propose to her the idea that, I will stick by you during the pregnancy. I want to be a part of the child's life no matter what, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be married to do that. And she put it to me very plainly.
You'll never see me again.
If you don't marry me, you're not having anything to do with this child. Period.
It is the ultimate blackmail. Guess what? I'm pregnant. And now you're stuck. Anything is possible with this woman. She'll do anything.
I felt like I'd put myself in a situation where I didn't really have a lot of a choice. The value of being a parent had to trump really everything else. A couple days later, we went out and had a nice little engagement dinner. In that moment, I tried to get as much out of it as I could, get as much joy and celebration as I could, and kind of leave the other stuff behind. And even though it wasn't going to be as pure as I wanted originally, still could be something.
The fact that he stays with her after all of this is a huge testament to his character. But it also tells her, I can do anything I want to this guy. And you know what? He's going to stick around. Why? Because he has a conscience. She doesn't.
In June of 1994, Brian and Kimberly have a small, intimate wedding in New Mexico.
We had a little wedding at my mom's house, and I tried to maintain an air of kind of celebration and that I was happy about it and everything, but deep inside, I was really scared and just dreading kind of what was to come. To the point where right after the ceremony, I kind of went in the back of the house and just kind of had a good cry and just kind of let out so many of these emotions that I was having there.
The couple move in together, and a few months later in November, Kimberly gives birth to their son, Jamie.
After Jamie was born, I was jubilant. And so it was kind of a nice period of time. It was pretty calm, relatively peaceful. I felt a sense of relief that maybe this was gonna start to be okay. Maybe we can make this work. But then things really kind of went downhill. I remember one time I had gone into the bedroom and locked the bedroom door because I was trying to kind of get away from her. So she started like kicking the door. And so I was like, okay, this is not good. So I opened the door and I walked out. And then this hammer comes just whizzes by my head and sticks into the wall. And I turned around and I looked at her, and she had kind of this wild look in her eyes.
The hammer lodges itself in the wall, and what does she do? She leaves it there. She tells him, don't you touch that hammer. Why? She wants to remind him, if you don't do what I say, there's gonna be a price.
And I just remember just this horrible feeling just washed over me about, man, what am I doing? How am I ever gonna get through this? It was just definitely just the low point in my life.
Kimberly's violent streak is only just beginning.
We were sitting in a car and she got angry with me because of a conversation we were having, and she, with her fist, just punched me as hard as she could in the face. It was just such a shock that I just said, I'm done. That punch in the face was really just the final straw. I just got out of the car and I left and never went back.
Brian immediately files for divorce from Kimberly. Over the following months, the battle for custody of his son becomes emotional warfare, with Kimberly pulling out all the stops to make Brian's life miserable.
Brian, this is Kimberly. I'm sick of being hung up on. The only reason why I tried you at 7:45 at work is because I had been trying your other number since last night.
So at this point, she was not working at all. And she would call me all the time. At some point, I started creating a phone log all the times that she'd called me. I counted one day, like literally 50 times she called me at work.
I'm just disgusted with your treatment of me. I'm disgusted with your ulterior motives.
She would call, and I would say, I'm busy, and then she would start threatening the receptionist. It was just insanity. Eventually, I decided to leave my first job just because she had called me at work so many times. But I was giving her basically all my money. I was still paying her rent and like giving her probably 75% of my paycheck every month. That was a tough time.
Brian can't afford a lawyer and sees Jamie at Kimberly's whim during the divorce process. When the dust settles in 1995, he gets shared custody of Jamie, but Kimberly continues to make life difficult.
She would kind of do a bait and switch in terms of visitation with my son.
I'm not keeping him from you, but I'm not going to allow him to go off overnight until several matters are mediated.
That was the big thing, was I was always at her mercy when I could see him. One time, she got really mad at me and decided I wasn't going to see Jamie anymore, ever. I showed up at her house, and she wouldn't give him to me.
It doesn't make any sense why you would drive all the way out here knowing that I'm not going to turn Jamie over.
Another time, I came anyway, even though she said she wasn't going to let me have him, and then she just let me have him. So she just liked to play games with the visitation.
It's a tough blow for Brian.
I loved my son before he was born. To see him and spend time with him, it's almost like a spiritual, you know what that connection is like.
Really, the only hold that she has over Brian now is the child. But that's a huge piece of leverage. She has a piece of Brian's heart. She knows the guy is a caring individual and that he loves his child. So she is totally using this child to manipulate the guy.
Over the years, Jamie pays a steep price for being Brian's son.
I was concerned. A lot of times he would call me asking me for help. He would tell me things that were alarming. Like, she started screaming at me, and so I ran out the door and ran down the street to someone's phone to call.
Hey, Daddy, it's me.
Those kinds of calls are gut-wrenching. I was really scared for him.
When he's just 11 years old, Jamie makes a chilling confession to Brian.
They had this big physical conflict. She put a belt around his neck.
She wraps a belt and drags the kid around the room. Let me drag him around the room, cut off his oxygen to let him know who the boss is. Could it get any more violent than that?
Jamie was at a point where he thought he was going to be strangled. He thought that his life was going to end. So it was a dramatic escalation in violence.
Sorry. I saw outright abuse that leaves bruises, marks. I was horrified. What parent wouldn't be horrified to see their child injured?
When Brian hears about this, that's it. He's got to take that kid out of that house. He has to. When you look at all of this building up, what is she gonna do next? What's left? Murder?
Brian Cargill has just found out that his 11-year-old son has been physically abused by his ex-wife, Kimberly.
I finally had evidence, like hardcore, irrefutable evidence that I could take to a judge and make some progress. I took photographs of the abuse and then immediately went to an attorney.
Brian reports Kimberly to Child Protective Services, providing them with proof of her abuse. And 10 years after the divorce in 2006, he finally gains full custody of Jamie.
It was a positive step for sure. At least now I had some sense of stability with my son.
But shockingly, the courts still allow Kimberly unsupervised visitation.
He would go to her house every other weekend. And there was always that worry for him.
With the system failing his son, Brian remains vigilant and keeps a watchful eye on Kimberly. But soon, he finds a measure of peace after meeting a woman worthy of his love.
We met and kind of hit it off, and after that, that was it. It's like we didn't really date anyone else. From our first date, we were pretty much, okay, this is it. I knew that she would make my life better. She is truly like the most emotionally stable person I know. So for me, that was a big, as you can imagine, that was a big priority.
Kimberly moves on with her life as well. She goes to nursing school and marries another man. They have a son.
Happy first birthday. We love you, Keith, Jill, Madeline, and Hayden.
But it doesn't last. Soon, Kimberly is divorced and engaged in yet another custody battle. This time, it will turn deadly. The trouble begins when she decides to hire a babysitter for her 4-year-old son while she's at work as a licensed nurse.
A friend of hers mentions a woman, Cherry Walker, in an apartment building not far from where she lives. By all accounts, she's just this wonderful, warm, 39-year-old woman.
Cherry was described as a very friendly, agreeable individual who had an interest in babysitting. Cherry had an IQ of 56, so this is profoundly developmentally disabled. So she was operating at a 6th grade level. So someone who could arguably be very easily manipulated.
She's living in an apartment by herself for the first time in her life. She has an aide that visits her at the apartment to make sure she's doing okay. And in walks Kimberly Cargill. The devil walks into Cherry Walker's life. And it's never going to be the same again.
Cherry is unable to say no to Kimberly, who takes advantage of her kindness.
Kimberly would drop the son off at Cherry's apartment and just leave him there for hours, come back super late or the next morning to pick him up. Cherry was on a very fixed income given her disability. She relied on food stamps to buy food for herself. And so she had this little boy at her house who would be dropped off hungry. Kimberly didn't leave any money for food, so Cherry would share hers.
Kimberly found someone she could exploit at will. Hey, can I drop the kid off for 2 hours? She'd come back 8 hours later. Or she'd drop the child off and maybe not show up for 2-3 days.
Thanks a lot for
She knew that Cherry Walker really wasn't going to say anything about this, that she could just continually do this over and over and over again.
The boy's father accuses Kimberly of abusing their son.
Kimberly Cargill's child is being abused, and social services gets involved, and they open an investigation against her.
In March of 2010, Child Protective Services removes Kimberly's son from her home. A custody hearing is ordered, and Cherry Walker is unwittingly caught up in the legal battle.
The court subpoena Cherry Walker to testify in court against Kimberly Cargill.
Cherry receives a subpoena as a frequent caretaker of the little boy. Immediately, Kimberly becomes concerned because if Cherry Walker is taking the stand in court, it'll become quickly evident that Kimberly's really not fit to be caring for a young child.
I think that Kimberly was specifically worried about Cherry's testimony because Cherry was probably going to say something truthful, saying that she was a bad mother and violent.
Cherry's taking care of that child. She had seen the abuse and the neglect that Kimberly Cargill perpetrated against that child. She was really the best witness.
I think that Kimberly believed everything was riding on this particular hearing. This was the last son she had custody of. This was her last hope to prove that she was a competent mother. This was her last chance.
Kimberly's first reaction is to just blow up Cherry Walker's phone. She actually calls her over 70 times, so she's panicking.
Cherry is not the only person who Kimberly is frantically calling. On June 18, 2010, just 5 days before Kimberly's custody hearing is set to begin, she phones her ex, Brian.
I was on the way out of town with my wife going on a long weekend, and Kimberly called me. I saw it was her and I didn't answer. She left a message on my voicemail. It was a bit frantic. Have you been subpoenaed? What are you going to tell them if they subpoena you? It was a little strange, but I just kind of disregarded it. Kimberly was really the last person that I wanted to hear from.
The next day, on June 19th, a driver on a small country road makes a tragic discovery.
This young guy is out delivering pizza. He's driving down the road and he realizes he went past the address, so he has to do a turnaround. He heads into this gravel area where it's an open field, and then he looks and he sees what appears to be a body. So of course, he dials 911, and in come the crime scene guys.
Investigators rush to the scene.
They find a woman face down, and it appears that she had been burned. Her body has been charred. Her skin is actually peeling off. It's been burned so badly. And in between her legs, they find this empty creamer container. It's not burned. They also determine that the victim has not been there long, probably within 24 hours.
Investigators determined that this person likely died of homicidal violence because this body was so badly burned, they couldn't identify who it was.
Detectives can't find an ID anywhere near the body, so they put out a media alert in hopes of getting any information on their Jane Doe. Across town, Guthrie and Rowan Walker, a pastor and his wife, reach out to police. Their beloved daughter has been missing for 24 hours.
This is a daughter who is constantly in touch with them. There's not maybe 4 hours that go by that they don't know where she is. Nobody has seen her. And there's one thing their daughter never does, and that is miss church. But on this day, she never shows up. And this is when they begin to realize something's drastically wrong here. So where is she? A media report goes out of this victim that's found, and they just know in their heart and their soul that it's her. So they go to the police, and sure enough, it's their daughter, Cherry Walker.
Smith County sheriffs have identified a burned female victim as Cherry Walker by using her dental records. Brian Cargill finds out about Cherry's murder when he gets a call from Kimberly's mother.
That kind of blew me away. It was pretty surreal. And I immediately kind of made the connection with Kimberly. Maybe she had something to do with this. Jamie and I went into hiding immediately. It was surreal for sure. I never imagined that I would be in that kind of a situation where I'd be afraid that someone was going to come and attack us. It was a scary thought, that maybe she had gotten into this manic state and was ready to come out and kill everyone she knew.
investigators conduct a search of Cherry Walker's apartment, looking for leads.
They're looking around, and they discover several voicemails. They're from a woman named Kim, who says, "Hey, Cherry, I have to talk to you." And she sounds a bit frantic.
Cell phone records also showed that this number had called Cherry over and over and over and over. There were dozens upon dozens of phone calls to Cherry Walker the day before she went missing.
So investigators immediately need to find out, who is this Kim? They interview Cherry Walker's aide, and they ask her, "Do you know anybody named Kim?" "Oh yeah, I know somebody named Kim. That's Kimberly Cargill." So now they're getting somewhere.
Cherry's caregiver was one of the last people to see her before she went missing, and during the course of questioning her, police learn about the situation with Kimberly Cargill, the babysitting arrangement, the subpoena, and the child custody hearing. She says Kimberly told Cherry not to go to court, to ignore the subpoena, but Cherry wanted to follow the rules. She was really concerned about getting in trouble.
She's scared. Kimberly is blowing up Cherry's phone, calling, and she wants to meet with Cherry to discuss the situation.
In Cherry's last conversation with the caregiver, Cherry says Kimberly is going to come over. She's going to take me out to dinner. And Cherry's caregiver tells her, "Do not go, lock the door, go to bed. Do not answer if Kimberly comes to your house, and don't go anywhere with her."
She goes, "Listen, ignore Kim, get some sleep, and tomorrow we'll deal with all of this." But for Cherry Walker, tomorrow never comes. The aide never sees her again.
Investigators head directly to Kimberly's house to speak with her.
She comes to the door, and they say, "Hey, listen, we want to talk to you about Cherry Walker." And she says, "I don't think I should talk to you without my lawyer." That's a red flag. If you're a friend of this woman's, why wouldn't you want to talk to us?
Kimberly maintained her arrogant disposition the whole way. The police wanted to search the house, and Kimberly would not permit them.
So investigators park down the street. They sit in their car, and they wait for Kim Cargill to leave. She leaves. She starts driving. Kimberly is really frantic. She's totally out of her mind. And she blows through a stop sign. So they pull her over. And immediately, what do they notice in her car? One of those creamer containers. And what do they have at their crime scene where Cherry Walker was dumped? They have that same empty container of creamer. So there's a connection. They seize her car, and they tow that car to forensics.
While the forensics team searches Kimberly's car for evidence, police execute a search warrant for her home.
Investigators made note that the house was messy. There were dirty clothes, trash everywhere, pieces of food on the floor, used takeout, fast food containers, trash in the bathtub. It was very unclean and disarray.
And then they go into the laundry room. They see laundry piled up from probably weeks. But in the washing machine, there's one sheet. Kim Cargill was washing one sheet? Question mark. Why? At the crime scene, they found these tire tracks, and those match perfectly to Kimberly Cargill's vehicle. They also find that Kimberly's DNA matches the DNA found on the coffee creamer container found between Cherry Walker's legs. They have now connected Kimberly Cargill to the murder scene and to the body. She is arrested, and they charge her with capital felony murder. She's dead to rights. There's no doubt in their mind that Kimberly Cargill murdered Cherry Walker.
Kimberly Cargill has been arrested and charged in the brutal murder of her son's babysitter, 39-year-old Cherry Walker.
It was a big relief when she was arrested. We all kind of were able to breathe a little better, sleep a little bit better at night. There was really not a doubt in my mind that she was guilty.
In May of 2012, Kimberly's case goes to trial in Smith County. By this time, and much to Brian's relief, Kimberly has had minimal contact with her son, Jamie.
As a prosecutor, I believe she killed Cherry Walker, and I wanted to get justice for Cherry. I believed in the evidence. When you have an item with the DNA sample, that belongs to Kim Cargill, and Kim Cargill knows Cherry Walker, and Cherry Walker was going to be picked up by her that night. You know, it's not hard to put two and two together on this.
You just dumped a body, killed someone and dumped a body, and set it on fire.
It appears that Kimberly Cargill strangled Cherry Walker inside her house, wrapped her in a sheet, took her out into that field by the road, untangled her from the sheet, poured some sort of accelerant on her, and lit her on fire to cover up forensic evidence.
She killed her. She dumped her body and burned it so she wouldn't get caught. It all supports everything that common sense tells you. That Kim didn't want Cherry to testify. She didn't want her to go to that hearing because she felt like it was going to be a problem. And then all of a sudden, Cherry's dead. So, it all fits.
Kimberly takes the stand in her own defense and pleads not guilty.
Her defense was that she was there when Cherry Walker died, but she did not kill her. She said that she took Cherry out to dinner to talk about the whole situation.
She says she's driving down the road and Cherry Walker had a seizure and that she could not save her or revive her from it. She died.
She said she drove around in a panic, dumped the body into a field, and burned it because she was afraid, even though she said she didn't kill her, she would get blamed for it, so she tried to dispose of the body.
There's a point where Kimberly's behavior kind of borders on delusional. She was supremely confident in her ability to escape responsibility, to manipulate. She thinks that the jury is going to look at this excuse and say, oh, that makes sense. Your friend dies, so you set them on fire and dump their body.
Brian Cargill is called as a witness for the prosecution.
When I was in court testifying and on the stand, I did not want to look at her. I was aware of her, but I never really looked her in the eye. I just had no need for that. What she had done was horrible. She took someone else's life, which is hard to even really fathom.
The jury quickly comes back with a verdict.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Kimberly Cargill, guilty of the offense of capital murder as charged in the indictment.
The verdict came in, I felt relieved that Kim had been held accountable for what she did.
Kimberly Cargill is found guilty on all counts of capital felony murder, and they vote for the death penalty.
It didn't surprise me at all that she would get the death penalty. She took advantage of Cherry to that degree and then turned around and killed her. I mean, that's just outrageous. It really is outrageous.
In the aftermath of the sentencing, those who knew Kimberly are left wondering how she could have committed such a heinous act.
That always stuck out to me, that we have this spectrum of goodness and kindness and a sweet person cross paths with everything that was bad and evil. Kim was someone who had no empathy for others, no feelings of regret or remorse for anything she did.
Kimberly was nothing but a menace who abused Brian and abused her children. I think she is one of the most vindictive, violent female psychopaths ever. Brian Cargill should consider himself lucky, and he should count his blessings because he was sleeping with the devil. Only the devil decided not to kill him, but to kill somebody else.
Even though she met a tragic end, Cherry's light will never be forgotten.
When the trial concluded, there was a photo and evidence of Cherry. She was smiling. She was happy. I printed that photo. I put it in a frame. I wanted that photo in my office to remember as a prosecutor why you do it. Her father told me that I never thought lawyers or law enforcement would care about a mentally handicapped black woman. It hurt me that he had to carry that with him. It broke my heart. I was very proud that we were able to get justice for her, show him that we did care deeply for your daughter. She was a beautiful woman. We fought hard for her, and now Kim will be held accountable for what she did.
As for Brian, he's moved on from the turmoil and found a silver lining in his life.
You know, they say time heals all wounds. It's a cliche, but I think every single day heals a little bit more. My kids have really taught me kind of how to love, if you will. Jamie, he's doing much better now. He's a chef. He's got a good job, and he's adulting, which is what we raise him for. We live in a household of 5, my wife and I, and 3 dogs. It's great. I mean, I don't have any complaints. We're able to live life pretty stress-free and, you know, do what we want to do. And so, you know, I feel pretty good.
At 6:14 a.m., the fog still clung to the asphalt like a second skin. A jogger slowed near the turnout off Highway 49, drawn not by curiosity, but by a smell that didn't belong to the pine trees or the cold river air. It was metallic.
Sweet. Wrong.
By the time the first patrol car arrived, the sun had barely crested the hills of Northern California, and the word murder was already being whispered over the radio, careful, almost afraid to say it out loud, as if naming it would make it permanent. She lay half-hidden by blackberry thorns, face turned away, jacket soaked through, one shoe missing. No purse, no ID, just a young woman, late 20s maybe, reduced to a set of unanswered questions before anyone even knew her name. Within hours, yellow tape carved the roadside into a crime scene, and a quiet foothill town found itself at the center of a nightmare it didn't recognize as its own. This was California in 1998, a place where people left doors unlocked, where crimes happened somewhere else, to someone else. Not here, not like this. But by noon, local news vans had arrived, antennas stabbing at the sky, reporters rehearsing the same phrase over and over, a brutal killing under mysterious circumstances. And just like that, the case stopped being private. It became a headline. Detectives worked fast. They always do at the beginning, when hope still exists. Tire impressions were photographed. Cigarette butts collected. Fibers lifted. Blood samples carefully sealed, tagged, logged. A partial footprint near the embankment hinted at a struggle. There were no witnesses. No screams reported. Just a stretch of highway thousands of people used every week, now transformed into a place everyone avoided. By nightfall, the victim had a name. Emily Navarro, 27 years old. Dental hygienist. Recently moved from Sacramento. Described by friends as cautious, routine-driven, the kind of person who texted when she got home safe. Except this time, the text never came. Her car was found the next morning, abandoned in a grocery store parking lot 10 miles away. Doors unlocked. Keys missing. No signs of a break-in. No blood. Nothing that made sense. Investigators stared at it, searching for logic, but the car was clean in a way that felt deliberate, almost staged. The first theory came quickly: abduction. Someone had taken her,
Forced her out.
or convinced her to go. Neither option sat well. Emily was 5'2", barely 100 pounds. If there had been a struggle at the car, there would have been signs. If she'd gone willingly, who had she trusted enough to do that at 11:40 p.m. on a Tuesday night? Neighbors were interviewed. Co-workers questioned. An ex-boyfriend flown in from out of state. Everyone cooperated. Everyone had alibis. The case ballooned, then stalled, the way so many do. Leads flooded in at first. Tips from psychics, anonymous calls, people convinced they'd seen her at a gas station, at a diner, walking along the road. None of it held. The autopsy revealed blunt force trauma. Multiple blows. Rage, the medical examiner noted. Not a robbery gone wrong. Not random. Personal, maybe. Or, at least violent enough to feel that way. There was foreign DNA under her fingernails. Trace amounts. Too small to be useful. Or so it seemed in 1998. Weeks passed. Then months. The press moved on. The tape came down. Flowers at the roadside wilted and disappeared. The town returned to normal on the surface, but underneath, something had shifted. People locked doors now. Parents called when their kids were late. Joggers stopped using that stretch of road. Inside the evidence room, boxes were stacked, labeled forgotten. Emily Navarro's name slid from breaking news to file number. And without anyone noticing the exact moment it happened, the investigation crossed an invisible line from active case to something colder. A cold case. Years went by. Detectives retired. Technology changed. New crimes took priority. Every so often, someone would pull the file, flip through photos yellowing at the edges, and sigh. No suspect. No weapon. No confession. Just a dead woman and a town that never quite shook the feeling it had failed her. Then, nearly 2 decades later, a lab technician in Sacramento reran a sample that had been considered useless. Not because of a hunch, not because of a tip, but because science had finally caught up to the past. The DNA under Emily's fingernails, once too fragmented to read, suddenly spoke. And what it said would stun investigators, reopen wounds long scarred over, and prove that some stories don't end when the headlines fade. They just wait. Cold. Silent. Patient. The DNA hit didn't arrive with sirens or celebration. It came quietly, printed on a lab report, slid across a stainless steel table under fluorescent lights that hummed like tired insects. A single profile. Partial, degraded, but no longer meaningless. It didn't match anyone in the system. Not then. Not yet. But it was enough to wake the dead file. Enough to pull Emily Navarro's case out of the cold storage shelf where it had been gathering dust and regret. Detective Mark Halvorson was the one who reopened it. 23 years on the force, a career shaped by robberies, domestic disputes, overdoses. He hadn't been there in 1998. That mattered. He had no emotional residue, no old theories to defend. Just a box of evidence and a mandate from the department. Take another look. See if anything speaks now. He started where everyone always does. The timeline. Tuesday night. November. Emily leaves work at 6:10 p.m. stops at a dry cleaner. Buys groceries at 7:02. Calls her sister at 8:14. Says she's heading home. The phone goes silent at 11:40. 3 hours unaccounted for. 3 hours that swallowed her whole. Halvorson pinned photos to a board. Emily smiling at a barbecue. Emily in scrubs at work. Emily's abandoned car, captured under harsh parking lot lights, grainy and distant. He read transcripts of interviews conducted decades earlier. Voices frozen in typewritten lines. She was careful. She wouldn't go with a stranger. She had no enemies. Everyone always says that. He tracked down the original detectives, most now retired, some bitter, some relieved to finally talk. They remembered the pressure. The mayor calling. The press circling. The fear that if they didn't solve it fast, it would never be solved at all. They remembered suspects who felt promising until they weren't. A drifter. A coworker with a temper. A man who owned a similar car. All dead ends. One name, though, kept reappearing in the margins. Not highlighted. Not circled. Just present. A man who lived 2 blocks from Emily's apartment. A man interviewed once briefly. A man cleared on paper and forgotten in practice. His name was Daniel Reese. In 1998, Reese was 34. Recently divorced. Worked nights at a packaging plant. No criminal record. Told police he'd been home asleep the night Emily disappeared. No one contradicted him. No one confirmed it either. Back then, that had been enough. Halvorsen didn't trust enough. He trusted patterns. And the pattern here was proximity, geography, convenience. Crimes like this rarely traveled far. They happened close. Uncomfortably close. He pulled Reese's file.
Thin. Too thin.
No fingerprints taken. No DNA sample. In 1998, unless you were arrested or convicted, you didn't go into a database. Reese had slipped through that gap like smoke. Halvorsen ran his name again. This time, the screen filled with something it hadn't before. A DUI in 2007. A domestic disturbance in 2011. A restraining order filed, then dropped. Nothing that screamed killer. Just enough to whisper, "Pay attention." Meanwhile, the town remembered. Word spread fast that Emily's case was active again. Old neighbors called in tips they'd convinced themselves were useless. A woman mentioned screams she'd heard years ago, dismissed at the time as coyotes. A gas station attendant recalled a man arguing with a woman near a payphone. No names. No certainty. Just fragments resurfacing from guilt and time. Halvorsen walked the route Emily would have taken home. He did it at night, alone, headlights cutting through darkness that felt thicker than it should have. The turnout where her body was found came up suddenly, a blind spot where the road curved and trees closed in. A place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. Or unless someone showed it to you. That thought stayed with him. Back at the lab, forensic analysts worked the DNA again, pushing it through newer algorithms, building a profile that could be compared in ways unimaginable in the late 90s. They didn't have a match yet, but they had something else. A familial connection.
Distant. Faint.
But real. Someone related to Emily's killer had uploaded their DNA to a public genealogy site. Not to help police. Not to confess. Just curiosity. A holiday gift. A search for ancestry that unknowingly cracked open a grave. The list of possible family trees narrowed. Then narrowed again. Names crossed off. Branches pruned. Until one line pointed back to Northern California. Back to a last name Halvorsen recognized. Reese. It wasn't proof. Not yet. It was a direction. And directions are dangerous things when they lead somewhere you don't want to go. Halvorsen requested surveillance. Old-fashioned, quiet. No warrants. No confrontations. Just observation. Daniel Reese was 58 now. Grayer.
Heavier. Slower.
He lived alone in a small rental on the edge of town.
Same town.
Same roads. Same shadows. He worked part-time at a hardware store. Smiled at customers.
Kept to himself.
No one thought twice about him. That was the most unsettling part. They followed him for weeks. Nothing. No outbursts. No suspicious meetings. Just routine. But routines can be deceptive. They're what people build when they're hiding something underneath. Then came the trash pull. Late one night, officers retrieved discarded items from Reese's bin. Coffee cups. Paper towels. A used tissue. All bagged, logged, rushed to the lab. When the results came back, no one spoke at first. The DNA from the trash didn't just resemble the sample from Emily Navarro's fingernails. It matched. 20 years collapsed into a single moment. The cold case wasn't cold anymore. It was burning. But a match is not a confession. It's a door opening, not a body falling through it. Halvorsen knew better than to rush. He knew what defense attorneys did with time gaps and circumstantial evidence. He knew the past could be slippery. They brought Reese in for a voluntary interview. He agreed. Of course he did. People who believe they've gotten away with something for decades often mistake confidence for immunity. In the interrogation room, he looked smaller than his file photo. Polite.
Calm.
He talked about the weather. About retirement. About how strange it was that police were still thinking about that old murder. Halvorsen slid the photo across the table. Emily. Reese's eyes flickered. Just once. Barely perceptible. But enough. Did you know her?
No.
Did you ever speak to her?
No.
Were you near Highway 49 on November 17th, 1998? Silence. A pause too long to be comfortable. I don't remember, Reese said finally. Memory is a curious thing. It sharpens when it needs to, dulls when it's threatened. The interview stretched on, questions circling, tightening. Reese denied everything. Asked for a lawyer. The session ended. Outside, reporters waited. Cameras ready. The headline was already forming. California 1998 cold case solved. But Halvorsen wasn't ready to say that word yet. Solved meant finished. It meant certainty. And there was still one thing missing. The truth. Somewhere between the lab reports and the silence of that interrogation room, the case had shifted again. From mystery to confrontation. From forgotten to unavoidable. And for the first time since that foggy morning on Highway 49, the man who might have killed Emily Navarro knew something the rest of the town was just beginning to understand. The past had found him. The arrest didn't happen that night. It never does in stories like this. Instead, the town went to sleep under a sky that felt lower than usual, heavier, as if the clouds themselves were listening. Daniel Reese drove home after the interview, hands steady on the wheel, posture relaxed enough to convince anyone watching that nothing had changed. But something had. The balance was gone. The long-held illusion of safety for him, for the case, had cracked. Inside the department, the word match spread in hushed tones. DNA from a decades-old murder aligned with a man who had lived his life in plain sight, untouched, unremarkable. The kind of revelation that excites prosecutors and terrifies investigators in equal measure. Because a scientific truth still had to survive a courtroom built on doubt. Halvorsen knew what they needed next. Corroboration. Something old made new. Something Reese couldn't explain away with silence and a lawyer. They reopened the witness list from 1998. Not to reread it. To relive it. Names that hadn't been spoken in years were dialed again. Voices older now. Guarded, surprised to be pulled back into a night they'd spent a lifetime trying to forget. Some couldn't remember details anymore. Others remembered too much. One woman, a former gas station clerk, paused for a long time when Halvorsen asked about November nights near the highway. Then she said something that made him sit up straight. There was a guy, she said slowly. Came in around midnight. Mud on his boots. Hands shaking. Bought cigarettes and lighter fluid. I remember because he paid in cash and wouldn't look at me. She'd reported it once. In '98. No one had followed up. Halvorsen pulled old receipts. The gas station had closed years ago, but its records had been archived, boxed, nearly forgotten. Nearly. There it was. A transaction logged at 12:07 a.m. Lighter fluid. Cigarettes.
Cash.
The security footage was gone. The clerk's memory wasn't. Then came the neighbor. The one who'd heard something but convinced herself it was nothing. Back then, she told police about muffled shouting around 11:30 p.m., somewhere near the road.
Coyotes, they'd said.
She'd accepted that answer because it was easier than believing the alternative. Now, she wasn't so sure. Each fragment tightened the circle. None of it proved guilt alone. Together, they formed something heavier. A gravity, while pulling everything back to one man. Halvorsen requested a search warrant for Reese's home. It took hours of paperwork, careful phrasing, the kind of legal choreography that decides whether justice walks free or gets thrown out on a technicality. When the judge finally signed, it was just after dawn. Officers arrived quietly. No sirens. No spectacle. They knocked once. Then again. Reese answered in a bathrobe, eyes sharp despite the hour.
He didn't resist. Didn't ask why.
He stepped aside as if he'd been expecting them for years. Inside the house, it was ordinary. Too ordinary. Clean countertops. Family photos turned face down in a drawer. No obvious trophies. No bloodstains glowing under forensic lights. Just a life scrubbed of edges. Until they reached the garage. Behind a row of paint cans and old tools, they found a plastic storage bin. Inside, wrapped in a trash bag that had yellowed with age, was a jacket.
Dark.
Heavy. The kind you'd wear on a cold November night. The lab would later confirm what Halvorsen already suspected. Microscopic traces. Soil consistent with the turnout on Highway 49. Fibers matching Emily Navarro's clothing. And, stitched into the lining, a faint smear. Blood. Degraded but undeniable. Reese said nothing when they took it away. He didn't have to. The jacket spoke for him. The interrogation room felt different this time. Smaller. Closer. The walls seemed to lean in, as if they wanted to hear. Reese sat across from Halvorsen, hands folded, face composed. "You've been carrying this a long time," Halvorsen said. Not a question. Reese stared at the table. "I don't know what you're talking about." Halvorsen slid the lab photos forward. The jacket. The fibers. The DNA comparison charts. He watched Reese's eyes move, calculating, measuring the distance between denial and inevitability. "You were there," Halvorsen continued. "She fought you. She left pieces of you behind. You couldn't clean that."
Silence. Thick.
Pressurized. Reese finally looked up. For the first time, the calm slipped. Just enough to reveal something underneath. Not fear, exactly, but exhaustion. The kind that comes from holding a lie together for decades. "She got in a car," he said quietly. Halvorsen didn't interrupt. "She was upset.
Crying.
I tried to help."
A pause.
She screamed. The words hung there, unfinished, dangerous. Not a full confession. Not yet. But closer than anyone had ever been. Reese stopped talking after that. Lawyer. End of interview.
The door closed.
Outside, the town erupted. News alerts buzzed. Arrest made in 1998 cold case. Cameras line the street. Emily Navarro's name trended for the first time in 20 years. People who'd never known her argued about guilt and innocence in comment sections, their certainty loud and hollow. But Halvorsen stayed late, alone with the file. Because even now, even with DNA and witnesses and a jacket soaked in history, something still bothered him. One detail didn't fit. Emily had defensive wounds. Extensive ones. She hadn't just fought. She'd resisted with everything she had. And yet there was no weapon recovered. No object linked conclusively to the fatal blows. Just trauma.
Force.
Hands, maybe. Or something small enough to disappear. If Reese was telling even a fraction of the truth, the encounter hadn't been planned. Which raised the most unsettling question of all. If it wasn't planned, how many times had he come close before? They ran his name again.
Deeper this time.
Across counties. Across decades. Missing persons. Unsolved assaults. Near misses filed under unknown mail. The system spat out a list longer than anyone wanted to see. Patterns emerged. Highway adjacent. Late night. Women alone. Emily Navarro wasn't an exception. She was the one who left enough behind to speak. As Reese sat in a holding cell, the weight of that reality settled in. The case wasn't just about closing a file. It was about what had been allowed to linger, unchallenged, in the gaps of an imperfect system. And as prosecutors prepared charges that would finally put a name next to the word killer, the town realized something else, something colder. The danger had never left. It had been living among them. Quiet. Patient. Waiting for science to catch up. The charges came down on a gray morning, the kind that flattens color and sound. First-degree murder. No statute of limitations. Time, for once, had failed to protect the man who had relied on it. Daniel Reese was transferred to county jail in shackles that felt heavier than metal, weighted by decades of borrowed normalcy finally collapsing under its own lies. But the case didn't tighten neatly. It rarely does. The deeper prosecutors dug, the more the ground shifted beneath their feet. Defense attorneys circled immediately, sharpening a strategy built on erosion.
25 years, they said.
Memories fade. Evidence degrades. Contamination happens. They pointed at the gaps like open wounds and asked the jury, in advance, to imagine doubt. Halvorsen watched it unfold with a familiar ache. This was the second phase of every resurrection. Not discovery, but survival. The truth had to endure scrutiny now, not just exist. They reconstructed the night again, frame by frame. This time with intent. Emily's route. Reese's shifts. Phone records pulled from archives, resurrected with the help of a telecom company that no longer existed in the same form. Towers mapped. Pings plotted. It wasn't precise. Nothing from 1998 ever was, but it narrowed the darkness. At 11:18 p.m., Emily's phone connected to a tower near the grocery store parking lot. At 11:33, another ping registered closer to the highway. Reese's phone, primitive analog, was harder to place, but billing records showed activity consistent with movement, not sleep, not home. The defense called it coincidence. The prosecution called it momentum. Then came the car. For years, it had been a blank slate, too clean to accuse. Now it was examined with newer eyes. Specialists found trace fibers embedded deep beneath the driver's seat rail, overlooked in the first pass. They matched the jacket from Reese's garage. The odds were microscopic. The implication was enormous. Reese watched the proceedings from behind glass, expression carefully neutral. He had learned the value of stillness, of letting others speak themselves into exhaustion. But stillness can betray you. Cameras catch it. Jurors read into it. Silence becomes its own language. Outside the courthouse, Emily's sister stood at a podium, hands trembling, voice steady by force of will. She spoke about unanswered birthdays, about a phone that never rang, about how grief doesn't age the way people do. It just waits. Inside, Halvorsen took the stand. He spoke plainly.
No teatrix.
He described the evidence as a constellation rather than a single star. DNA, geography, witnesses, behavior. He didn't say monster. He didn't say evil. He said pattern. The defense tried to rattle him. They asked about contamination, about tunnel vision, about why Reese hadn't been arrested in 1998 if he was so obvious. Halvorsen didn't flinch. Because we didn't have the tools, he said. Now we do. But even tools can slip. Midway through the pretrial hearings, a motion landed like a thunderclap. The defense challenged the genealogy-based DNA analysis, called it invasive, unreliable, a fishing expedition through private lives. They asked the judge to exclude it entirely. If granted, the case would bleed out. The courtroom held its breath as experts testified. Scientists explained probabilities, algorithms, margins of error. They spoke about how the profile wasn't a guess but a narrowing, how it led investigators to Reese, but did not convict him on its own. The judge listened, unreadable. Days passed. Then the ruling came. The DNA stayed. Not as the case, but as the compass that pointed to it. The trial date was set. Jury selection began. People filed in, ordinary and unprepared, carrying coffee cups and assumptions. Some remembered the headlines from 1998. Most didn't. To them, this was history resurfacing, distant and abstract. Until it wasn't. When the trial opened, the prosecution didn't rush. They let the story breathe. They started with the fog, the jogger, the smell that didn't belong. They let the jury meet Emily before they met her killer. Photos.
Testimony.
A life assembled from fragments. The defense countered with uncertainty, with alternate theories, with the idea that Reese had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, that his DNA could have transferred innocently, that the jacket could have been planted, misidentified, misunderstood. They spoke smoothly, confidently. Then came the witness the defense hadn't expected. A former coworker from the packaging plant. A man who'd worked nights with Reese in the late 90s. He testified reluctantly, voice low, eyes fixed on the floor. He said Reese had shown up late one shift in November 1998. Scratched, agitated, smelling like chemicals. He'd joked about hitting a deer. Everyone had laughed. No one had written it down. The courtroom went quiet. Reese stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. The stillness cracked again, just a hairline fracture, but enough. Jurors noticed. They always do. As the weeks dragged on, The trial became less about if and more about how much. How much weight could be placed on old evidence revived by new science? How much responsibility belonged to a system that had missed its chance the first time? Closing arguments loomed. The air grew heavier. Emily's family sat together, hands intertwined, bracing for an outcome they'd rehearsed for decades without ever believing it would arrive. And in a holding cell beneath the courthouse, Daniel Reese waited. Not for freedom, not even for mercy, for the verdict. Because no matter what the jury decided, one truth had already escaped containment. The past was no longer silent. And it wasn't done speaking yet. The jury deliberated behind a door that looked thinner than it should have been. 12 people, sealed off with nothing but binders, exhibits, and the weight of a woman's unfinished life pressing in from all sides. Outside, the courthouse hummed with the low anxiety of waiting, reporters pacing, family members staring at phones they didn't expect to ring, deputies standing still as if movement might tip the balance. Inside that room, time behaved strangely. Minutes stretched. Hours folded back on themselves. Jurors replayed testimony until voices blurred together. DNA experts explaining fractions and probabilities. Witnesses searching their own memories for truth. Attorneys polishing doubt until it gleamed. Someone asked whether absence could be evidence. Someone else asked whether time made lies stronger or weaker. No one had an easy answer. Daniel Reese sat alone beneath the building, listening to pipes knock and footsteps echo overhead. He had rehearsed this moment in fragments for years, imagining it would feel like fear. It didn't. It felt like pressure equalizing, like a long-held breath finally being released whether he wanted it to or not. He thought about November nights, about fog, about how quiet a scream can become when no one is close enough to hear it. When the jury filed back in, the room shifted. Chairs scraped. People leaned forward without realizing they were doing it. The foreperson's hands shook as they passed the paper to the bailiff. The verdict was read aloud.
Guilty.
Not all counts. Not every word the prosecution had hoped for. But enough. Enough to anchor the truth to a legal outcome. Enough to say that Emily Navarro's death was no longer just a story without an ending. Emily's sister closed her eyes. Not in relief. In release. A sound escaped her that wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a laugh. It was something older than either. Reese didn't react. He stared straight ahead, absorbing the word like a fact of weather. Sentencing was scheduled for weeks later. More waiting. More airless nights. More time for doubt to whisper. Defense attorneys filed motions anyway. Appeals were promised. The machinery of justice turned, slow and grinding, indifferent to emotion. But something else had begun to move. In counties up and down Northern California, detectives reopened files. Assaults from the late 90s. Abductions that had gone nowhere. Near misses that never made headlines. The pattern Halvorsen had glimpsed earlier now came into focus under a harsher light. Same corridors. Same hours. Same descriptions of a man who blended in until he didn't. One by one, women came forward. Some in their 40s. Some in their 60s. Stories they had buried because no one had asked the right questions at the right time. A hand on an arm. A ride offered. A sudden shift from friendly to furious when they said no. Most had escaped. Barely. Emily hadn't. Reese's name threaded through their accounts like a shadow you only recognize after you've turned around. Not enough to bring new charges. Enough to confirm something colder. Emily's case wasn't isolated. It was the point where the line finally snapped. At sentencing, the judge spoke about responsibility and consequence, about the arrogance of believing time could erase harm. Reese was given life with the possibility of parole decades down the line, a sentence that sounded abstract until the doors closed behind him and abstraction became routine. As he was led away, he glanced once toward the gallery. Not at Emily's family. At the reporters. At the lenses. As if he wanted to be seen one last time, not as a quiet man in a small town, but as something history would remember. The cameras followed him out. Then they left. Months passed. The courthouse emptied. Headlines faded again. this time with a different aftertaste. The town tried to settle back into itself, but some shifts don't reverse. Highway 49 was repaved. The turnout widened. A guardrail installed. Safety disguised as closure. Halvorsen returned to other cases. But Emily's file stayed on his desk longer than the rest. Not because it was unsolved, because it had opened something he couldn't unsee. The realization that justice doesn't arrive all at once.
It leaks in.
Through science. Through memory. Through people finally deciding to speak. One evening, long after the verdict, Halvorsen received an email from the lab. Routine, almost forgettable. A note about rerunning old samples connected to other cases. Improvements in extraction. Cleaner reads. Better resolution. He stared at the screen longer than necessary. Because he knew what that meant. Somewhere, in boxes still untouched, were stories waiting for the same accident of progress that had resurrected Emily Navarro. Stories that had gone cold not because they lacked truth, but because the world hadn't yet learned how to listen. Emily's case had been called solved. But the echo it left behind was anything but quiet. Because when one cold case breaks open, it doesn't just answer a question. It asks dozens more. The prison swallowed Daniel Reese the way it swallows everyone else, without ceremony, without memory. Intake forms. A number. A routine. The outside world compressed into a few cubic feet of concrete and steel. For the guards, he was just another aging lifer. For the system, a closed loop. Case resolved. File archived. But cases don't end when the door locks. They end when the damage stops spreading. And in the months after Reese's conviction, the damage kept moving, rippling outward in ways no sentence could contain. Halvorsen watched it happen from a distance at first. An email here. A phone call there. A detective from a neighboring county asking about methodology. Another asking about the jacket. Another about the genealogy angle. The questions all circled the same fear. What if we missed more? They formed a task force quietly. No press release. No public announcement. Just a handful of investigators comparing notes across jurisdictions that had once barely spoken to each other. Old rivalries set aside by a shared discomfort. They called it a review. It felt more like an excavation. Boxes were pulled from storage. Tape cracked. Paper sighed as it was opened for the first time in years. Assault reports written in shaky handwriting. Statements taken at kitchen tables. Sketches drawn from memory and doubt. The same phrases repeated across files like a refrain. Offered a ride, changed suddenly, wouldn't take no. The similarities were unsettling. The differences, worse. Different victims. Different outcomes. Same corridor of roads. Same late-night hours when help feels far away. One file stood out. A woman who vanished in 1996. Not murdered. Not confirmed dead.
Just gone.
Her car found near a rest stop.
Her purse inside. No body. No crime scene to speak of.
The case had drifted into limbo, categorized as a disappearance rather than an attack.
Until now.
When her name was run against the genealogy database, there was nothing. No DNA. No fingernails to speak. But there was geography. And there were witnesses who had never been re-interviewed with Reese's face in mind. Halvorsen drove to see one of them himself. A retired truck driver living alone in a trailer that smelled of oil and old coffee. The man squinted at the photo, then nodded slowly.
Yeah, he said.
That's him. Or close enough. Gave me the creeps.
Too friendly.
Asked if I'd seen a woman with dark hair. Said she'd dropped something.
Dropped something.
A phrase that echoed louder than it should have. Back in the task force room, the mood shifted. They were no longer chasing hypotheticals. They were mapping behavior. Opportunity. Escalation. Emily Navarro's murder was no longer an outlier. It was a culmination. The press caught wind eventually. They always do. A headline surfaced quietly at first, then louder. Convicted killer linked to other cold cases. The phrasing was careful. Legal. Non-committal. But the implication was explosive. Families called. Some hopeful. Some furious. Some exhausted beyond anger. They asked questions no one could answer cleanly. Why now? Why not sooner? Was it always him? Halvorsen didn't pretend to have certainty. He spoke about probability, about patterns, about how truth is sometimes assembled piece by piece long after the fact. It was never enough. It was all he had. Inside the prison, Reese declined interviews. He kept his head down, followed rules, became invisible again. But invisibility had lost its power. Every time another file crossed a desk, his name surfaced, uninvited, like a watermark that wouldn't fade. A corrections officer mentioned almost casually that Reese had asked about news coverage. Not about appeals, not about parole, about what people were saying, about whether other cases were being reopened. The past still mattered to him. That was telling. Then came the letter. It arrived at the DA's office without a return address.
Typed.
Clinical.
No threats. No remorse.
Just a suggestion. A sentence that made the room go quiet. You're looking in the wrong place for the rest.
No signature. No explanation.
But it wasn't a bluff. The timing was too precise. The references too specific. Details that hadn't been made public. The task force reconvened, tension coiling tight. Was it Reese? Someone protecting him? Someone exploiting the chaos? The letter offered no answers, only direction. And misdirection is its own form of control. They went back to the map. This time, they expanded it. New counties. New states. Truck routes. Employment records. Gaps in Reese's work history that had once been shrugged off as layoffs or overtime. The picture grew darker. One investigator said what everyone else was thinking but didn't want to say out loud. What if Emily wasn't the end? Silence followed, because the question carried a weight no one wanted to lift. Outside, the town tried to remember Emily for who she had been, not how she had died. A small memorial appeared near the turnout. Flowers, photos, a plaque installed by the county. People stopped there sometimes, engines idling, unsure whether they were paying respect or apologizing. At night, the road still curved the same way. Fog still rolled in. Cars still passed without slowing. Life moved forward because it always does. But in evidence rooms and prison corridors, the past refused to stay put. Because solving a cold case doesn't close a door. It opens a hallway. And once you're in it, there's no telling how many rooms are still waiting to be unlocked. The hallway didn't end where anyone expected it to. It bent. It branched. It disappeared into jurisdictions that no longer shared files, into years where records were handwritten and trust was assumed instead of verified. Each door the task force opened revealed another layer of silence, another reason why things had gone unnoticed for so long. They followed the gaps first. Employment records showed Reese had taken extended leave in the late 90s, periods dismissed at the time as plant shutdowns or personal days. When overlaid with missing person reports, the overlaps were impossible to ignore. 3 days here, a week there, always coinciding with someone who vanished, someone whose last known location hovered near a highway or a rest stop or a grocery store parking lot lit just well enough to feel safe. One case pulled them in deeper than the rest. A college student, 19, disappeared in 1997 while driving home for the holidays. Her car was found abandoned off a county road, engine cold, door ajar. No sign of struggle. No body. The file had been stamped runaway after 6 months and quietly shelved. Halvorsen stared at the photos. Same emptiness. Same false calm. He'd seen it before. They tracked down her roommate, now living 2 states away. She remembered a man at a gas station that night. Older. Friendly. Asked if they needed directions. Lingered too long. She'd laughed it off because nothing happened. Because something almost happening doesn't qualify as evidence. Until it does. The task force moved carefully. Every new connection risked overreach. Every public statement risked lawsuits. They spoke in conditionals and probabilities, even as the pattern sharpened to a blade. Inside the prison, Reese watched the news in fragments. Headlines stripped of nuance. Faces blurred by motion. He learned which channels lingered on the story and which moved on quickly. He learned the names of detectives he'd never met and counties he'd never been charged in. The hallway was catching up to him. When the DA's office requested another interview, he agreed. That alone raised eyebrows. Men who intend to maintain innocence usually don't invite conversation. Men who believe they still have leverage sometimes do.
He was older now.
Thinner. The posture of someone who'd adapted to confinement. But his eyes were alert, measuring. "You think she was the first," he said without being asked. The room went still.
No, Alborsen Diplaid.
"We think she was the one who left evidence." Reese smiled faintly. Not amusement. Recognition. As if someone had finally said the correct password. "You're still chasing ghosts," he said. "You won't find what you're looking for in those boxes." "Then where?" Reese leaned back. "Time moves things," he said. "Places change." It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even helpful. But it was confirmation of something far worse. There were places they hadn't looked because they hadn't existed anymore. Construction sites. Landfills. Riverbanks reshaped by decades of erosion. The task force expanded again. Old maps were pulled. Satellite imagery compared across years. Areas that had once been empty and were now parking lots or housing developments were marked in red. The list grew faster than resources could keep up. Families were notified carefully one by one. Not with promises. With possibility. For some, it reopened wounds they'd finally learned to live with. For others, it was oxygen after years of suffocation. One mother screamed when she heard Reese's name. Another went quiet and asked for the address of the prison. A third said she already knew. She'd seen him once, years earlier, at a hardware store. He'd helped her find a light bulb. She'd thanked him. That detail traveled through the task force like a chill. Evil rarely announces itself. It stocks shelves. It gives directions. It blends in. The media shifted tone. Less triumph. More unease. The phrase "cold case solved" was quietly amended with qualifiers. Potential links. Ongoing investigation. The certainty people had briefly tasted dissolved into something murkier. Late one night, an analyst flagged something small and devastating. A toll booth record from 1997. Cash payment. Timestamped within an hour of the college student's last known sighting. The vehicle description was incomplete, but the route matched Reese's commute pattern. It wasn't proof. It was alignment. And alignment, repeated enough times, becomes accusation. Halvorsen drove the route himself, long after midnight, windows down, letting the cold air cut through the fatigue. He imagined what it would take to stop someone on that road. What you'd say. How quickly trust could turn into fear. By the time he reached the end, he understood something he wished he didn't. The road made it easy. The system made it possible. Time made it survivable. Back at the office, the map on the wall looked less like a series of cases and more like a migration. Lines drawn between points, tracing a life lived in parallel with harm. Emily Navarro's photo sat at the center. Not because she was first. Because she was the one who refused to disappear completely. As the task force prepared to dig, literally in some places, the question shifted again. It was no longer how many. It was where. And somewhere, beneath concrete poured years too late, beneath water that kept its secrets well, answers waited. Not to be solved neatly, but to be found. They started with the places no one wanted to disturb. Not because they were sacred, but because they were inconvenient. Former industrial lots. Closed landfills. River bends that had been straightened, then forgotten. Places where paperwork said cleared and memory said nothing at all. Ground-penetrating radar hummed over cracked asphalt while traffic passed a few yards away, drivers unaware they were skimming the surface of unfinished stories. Crews marked anomalies with orange flags that fluttered like warnings no one else could read. Most hits turned out to be debris. Rebar. Old pipes. Buried junk. Every false alarm drained energy, sharpened doubt. Then one didn't. It was a narrow strip near a rest stop that no longer existed, demolished and rebuilt years earlier with better lighting and cleaner bathrooms. The radar showed a void that shouldn't have been there. A shape too deliberate to be natural. The team stood around it in silence, listening to the distant rush of trucks, each one a reminder of how much time had passed overhead. They dug slowly, carefully, every inch contested by soil compacted by years of neglect. When the shovel struck fabric, no one spoke. When bone appeared, someone turned away. Procedure took over, merciful and mechanical. Flags were replaced with tape, tape with lights, lights with cameras. The remains were incomplete, weathered. But the lab didn't need much. A femur, a fragment of skull. Enough to start a conversation across decades. Within weeks, the identity came back. The college student from 1997. Not a runaway. Not a mystery anymore. A victim whose name finally aligned with what had happened to her. Her family was notified by a pair of detectives who had rehearsed the words and still found them inadequate. Grief arrived late, but it arrived whole. The discovery broke something open. More sites were approved. More warrants signed. What had begun as a cautious review accelerated into a reckoning. Counties that had once guarded their data now shared it freely, as if afraid of what would happen if they didn't. Inside the prison, Reese stopped watching the news. Guards noticed. He spent more time in the yard, walking the perimeter in slow, even laps, counting steps. When asked if he wanted to make a call, he declined. When offered counseling, he laughed. He had always believed control meant silence. Now silence was being interpreted without him. The DA approached him again, this time with photographs he hadn't seen before. Excavation sites, evidence tags, a map with red circles multiplying like a rash. "You can help us," the prosecutor said. "Not should. Not must. Help." Reese studied the images, face unreadable. "You already know," he said finally. "We know where to look," she replied. "Not how to understand it." That earned a reaction. A flicker of irritation. Of ownership. Understanding, to him, was leverage. He asked for assurances. About his sentence. About his name in the record. They offered nothing concrete. Only the truth that cooperation could matter. Not in years shaved off, but in what history would say when it wrote him down. He said he'd think about it. Meanwhile, another site yielded fragments. Then another. Not all human. Not all conclusive. But enough to confirm the scale of what they were dealing with. The hallway had widened into a chamber, and the air inside was thin. Families gathered at press conferences now, standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers bound by absence. Some held photos laminated by time. Others carried nothing, afraid to hope too visibly. The language used by officials shifted again. No longer linked. Now consistent with. Now believed to be associated. Careful words. Heavy meanings. Halvorsen slept less. When he did, he dreamed of maps without labels, of roads looping back on themselves, a fog that erased faces as soon as he recognized them. He woke with the sense that he was chasing something that would never fully resolve, only settle into place like sediment. One afternoon, a corrections officer called the task force lead directly. Reese wanted to talk. Not in the interview room. In the yard, where the sky was visible and walls felt less absolute. They agreed. 2 detectives. No recorder. Just notes taken later, from memory, the way things used to be done. Reese walked with them, hands behind his back, eyes on the ground. He spoke without preamble. "There are places you won't find," he said, "because they don't exist anymore." He described a quarry filled in during the early 2000s. A stretch of river dredged after flooding. A construction site that became a mall. He didn't give coordinates. He gave impressions. Landmarks that might have been there once. "Why tell us now?" Halvorsen asked. Reese shrugged. "Because you're going to keep digging," he said. "And because you'll never know how many unless I say." "Then say it." Reese stopped walking. Looked up at the sky for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was flat. "I don't remember them as numbers," he said. "They blur together." It was the closest thing to remorse anyone would ever hear from him. Not sorrow. Fatigue. The notes were compared. The hints mapped. Some led nowhere. Some aligned with sites already flagged. One pointed to a river bend scheduled for development. The permit was halted within hours. When the dredging began, they found nothing at first. Then a shoe. Then another. The news cycle reignited, harsher this time. No victory language.
No triumph.
Just accumulation. The sense that the solved cold case had been a door, and behind it was a room no one had prepared to enter. As winter set in, the excavation slowed. Mud and rain made work dangerous. Some sites were deferred. The unanswered waited patiently, as they always had. And in the quiet that followed each discovery, one thought settled over everyone involved, heavy and unavoidable. Emily Navarro had not just been the reason this began. She had been the interruption. The moment where a long, quiet pattern failed. The moment when something finally pushed back. Winter compressed everything. The ground hardened. The days shortened. Search sites were wrapped in plastic and taped like unfinished sentences, marked for return when the weather allowed. What had been frenetic slowed to a crawl, and in that pause, the weight of what they'd uncovered settled in. It was easier to keep moving than to sit with the implications. Now there was no choice. Families waited through holidays with chairs left empty on purpose, plates set and cleared without comment. Some told themselves this year would be different. Some had stopped believing in different altogether. The task force kept working anyway, chasing paper when Earth was unavailable. Old permits. Flood records. Environmental impact reports that read like alibis for landscapes that had been altered beyond recognition. A clerk in a county office found a map misfiled under the wrong year. A hand-drawn notation in the margin marked a temporary access road used during a bridge repair in 1999. It crossed private land, then vanished into a ravine now overgrown and unremarkable. The notation didn't say why it mattered. It didn't have to. When the weather broke, they went there first. The ravine smelled of wet leaves and rust. Sunlight barely reached the bottom. The ground-penetrating radar traced uneven shapes, noise cluttering the readout until an anomaly emerged, elongated, shallow, and unmistakably out of place. They dug with care, learned the hard way. What they found wasn't a body. It was belongings. A wallet.
Keys.
A bracelet engraved with a date. The name matched a missing person report from 1999. Another file pulled from limbo into focus. Another family notified with words that arrived decades too late and still managed to shatter. The list grew. Not quickly. Relentlessly. Each discovery adding a line to a ledger no one wanted to finish. The press began to count. Investigators refused. Numbers felt obscene. Inside the prison, Reese's routines tightened. He stopped walking the yard. Stopped talking altogether. When asked if he wanted to add to his statement, he shook his head once and turned away. Control had slipped through his fingers, and with it went his interest in the game. But the system had questions that didn't require his permission. Analysts overlaid timelines again, now with confirmed sites anchoring speculation. The pattern refined itself. Approach, trust, isolation, disposal along corridors that erased evidence by design or neglect. Not random. Opportunistic. Rehearsed. Halvorsen watched younger detectives absorb it, their faces hardening with a knowledge he wished they didn't need. He corrected language when it drifted toward myth. "Don't make him bigger than he is," he said. "He used what was available. So did we." The trial transcripts from Emily's case were reread in this new light. Lines once argued as coincidence now read like confession by omission. The jacket. The lighter fluid. The lateness explained as a deer strike. The jury's verdict felt sturdier with every new confirmation, less a conclusion than a cornerstone. A reporter asked Halvorsen if he believed they'd ever know the full extent. He didn't answer right away. He looked past the microphones at the road, at the way fog pooled where water met cold. "No," he said finally, "but we'll know enough." That answer drew criticism. Families wanted absolutes. The public wanted a final number. Closure packaged cleanly. The task force could offer none of it without lying. In a small evidence room, An analyst matched a fiber from the ravine site to a batch manufactured in the late 90s and sold regionally through a chain that no longer existed. It didn't narrow suspects. It didn't need to. It tightened the weave. Another analyst confirmed something quieter, but just as devastating. In at least 2 cases, the victims had fought. Scratches. Broken nails. Evidence of resistance erased by time and terrain, but still legible if you knew where to look. Emily had not been unique in that. She had been lucky enough to leave proof. Spring came unevenly. Some sites yielded nothing. Some yielded too much. Each day brought calls that began with caution and ended with resolve. Permits were paused. Developments delayed. Progress argued against memory and, for once, lost. The town by Highway 49 held a vigil without speeches. Candles lined the guardrail installed years earlier, wax pooling into the cracks like a quiet offering. People stood shoulder to shoulder, strangers connected by the uncomfortable truth that safety had been an assumption, not a guarantee. Halvorsen stood at the edge, hands in his pockets, listening to the wind move through the trees. He thought about how close it had all come to staying buried. One jogger's pause. One sample rerun. One decision not to accept good enough. In the end, that was the story that remained after the headlines softened and the cameras left. Not the monster. Not the map. The interruption. Emily Navarro's case had broken the surface tension just enough to let everything else through. And once the water rushed in, there was no stopping it. Only steering, only deciding how much truth the ground could give before it closed again. As the task force prepared its final report, careful, conditional, honest about what would never be known, the feeling in the room was not victory. It was gravity. The sense that they were standing beneath something vast that would outlast them all. Because cold cases don't warm all at once. They thaw in pockets. And when they do, the past doesn't disappear. It rearranges itself. The room is quiet when the final report is read aloud, quieter than any interrogation room ever was, quieter than the night the crime happened, quieter than the decades that followed. Because silence now is weight, and every word lands like a closing door, the DNA match confirmed, the chain of custody intact, the probabilities collapsing into certainty. One profile emerging from the statistical fog like a face surfacing from dark water, and yet no one celebrates, no one exhales in relief. Because resolution does not sound like victory when it arrives this late, when the calendar says years have passed but the case file says the moment never really ended. It just kept breathing softly in the background of everyone's lives. The suspect's name sits on the page like a bruise. Ordinary. Unremarkable. A man who lived close enough to matter and far enough to vanish. In 1998, he was a neighbor, a passerby, a witness who was never interviewed, a shadow that didn't look like a shadow at the time. He worked, paid rent, smiled at clerks, stood in line at gas stations. While the city reeled and the community locked its doors at night, he blended back into routine, into anonymity, into the long stretch of years where the case cooled and the evidence slept. Now, decades later, his DNA speaks louder than any confession, louder than any denial, louder than the life he built on top of that buried night. Investigators replay the timeline not to find what they missed, but to understand how close they were without knowing it. The patrol logs, the street cameras that didn't exist yet, the calls that came in and went nowhere, the witness who described a man about average height, which fit half the county, the tip that named no one, the lead that stopped short of his door. It's all there, frozen in ink, every almost and nearly and not quite, a paper trail of human limitation. Technology didn't fail them. Time did. Or maybe time simply waited until the truth was ready to be seen. When they knock on his door, it's morning. It's always morning when the past catches up. He answers in a robe, confused, older, his hair thin, his face marked by years that the victim never got. He listens as they explain, watches their mouths move, tries to understand how something from 1998 could suddenly be standing on his porch in the present tense. He says very little. He doesn't have to. The evidence has already crossed the distance for him. A swab taken for a minor offense. A database quietly expanding. A genealogical tree branching backward until it snapped into place. Science did not accuse. It recognized. The arrest ripples outward, touching people who thought they were done with this story. Retired detectives get phone calls they never expected. Family members sit down when they hear the news because their legs give out before their emotions do. Journalists dust off old notes, reread headlines that once screamed mystery and now whisper accountability. The community reacts in fragments: shock, disbelief, grim satisfaction, anger that it took this long, fear at how close the answer always was. Some feel relief. Others feel robbed of it. Closure, it turns out, is not a universal language. For the victim's family, the word solved feels too clean. It doesn't account for birthdays missed, holidays spent staring at an empty chair, years defined by waiting for a phone call that never came. They hear the details again, even the ones they tried to forget, because justice requires repetition. They look at a photo taken before the crime and try to reconcile it with the knowledge of how it ended. The DNA match gives them a name, but it does not give them time back. It does not explain why. It does not erase the nights spent imagining every possible ending except the real one. In court, the facts line up neatly, but emotion does not. The prosecution speaks in measured tones about probabilities and loci and markers, about science as a neutral witness that cannot lie. The defense reaches for doubt, for contamination, for the possibility of coincidence, but the numbers are merciless. 1 in billions. One profile. One answer. The jury listens, the room heavy with the sense that something ancient is being finalized, that the past has finally run out of places to hide. When the verdict comes, it is swift. It lands without drama.
Guilty.
A word that carries more gravity than applause ever could. Outside, cameras flash, but no one smiles. The case is closed, but the word feels like a technicality. A door shut on a room that no one wanted to enter in the first place. The investigators speak to the press, careful with their language, crediting advancements, acknowledging mistakes, reminding the public that cold does not mean forgotten. They say justice delayed is still justice. They say this outcome proves patience matters. They do not say how many nights they lay awake wondering if the answer would ever come, or how many cases never get this ending. As the story fades from headlines, something else takes its place: reflection. On how many other samples sit in storage, waiting. On how many names are still unknown. On how progress is quiet and relentless, moving forward whether anyone is watching or not. The case becomes a reference point, a lesson cited in training rooms and conferences, proof that time is not always the enemy of truth. Sometimes time is just the distance the truth has to travel before it can be believed. And yet, in the neighborhoods where the story began, the air still remembers. People still point to the street where it happened, still lower their voices when they pass it, still feel a faint chill that has nothing to do with weather. The house looks different now. The faces are new. But memory has a long shelf life. It doesn't care about verdicts. It doesn't care about science. It lingers, stubborn and personal, in the places where fear once took root. Late at night, when the city hums and the news cycle sleeps, the case file sits closed on a shelf, its label neat, its contents final. But the story doesn't end there. It echoes in the minds of those who followed it, those who lived it, those who will never fully understand it. A cold case solved by DNA, yes. A breakthrough that stunned investigators, absolutely. But also a reminder that justice is not a moment. It's a long, uneven road, and sometimes it reaches its destination long after the damage is done. The last thing left is the question no technology can answer, no verdict can settle, no headline can contain. What does it mean to know the truth when the truth arrives too late to change the past? The answer hangs in the silence after the final gavel, in the space between relief and grief, in the quiet understanding that some mysteries end not with peace, but with acceptance. And as the lights go out and the room empties, the story remains, not as a warning, not as a promise, but as an echo, proof that even after decades of darkness, the past can still speak, and when it does, The sound is never as simple as justice. Time moves forward, but it does not move on. After the verdict, after the headlines thin out and the cameras disappear, the case settles into a strange second life, one that exists not in courtrooms or evidence lockers, but in memory, in routine, in the quiet moments when people realize that something they carried for decades has finally shifted, even if it hasn't vanished. The investigators return their badges, their notebooks, their habits, but the case follows them home, lingering in the way they double-check locks, in the way they pause at crime scene tape on the evening news, in the way they know now, without question, that the past is patient. The lead detective sits alone one night, the city glowing faintly through the window, rereading the earliest report from 1998. The paper smells old. The language is blunt, procedural, unaware of the years it would have to endure. Every sentence feels heavier now. Not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. He traces the margins with his finger, thinking about the version of himself who wrote this, younger, faster, certain that effort alone could solve anything. He doesn't feel guilt so much as humility. The case didn't beat him. It outlived him until science caught up. In the evidence room, shelves remain lined with boxes just like this one, each carrying its own silence, its own suspended moment. A technician catalogs samples under fluorescent lights, knowing that one day, years from now, a name might emerge from one of them, a life might fracture, a family might finally hear the truth. The work is methodical, almost boring, and yet every envelope feels charged, like a sealed confession waiting for the right moment to be understood. Cold cases are no longer dormant. They are merely waiting for the right language to speak. The community absorbs the outcomes slowly. Conversations at diners drift back to it. People say things like, "I remember when that happened," or "I never thought they'd solve it," or "He lived right there." The realization that the answer was nearby unsettles more than the crime itself. Evil, it turns out, does not always look like a headline. Sometimes it looks like a neighbor. That knowledge doesn't fade easily. It reshapes how people remember the past, how they interpret old interactions, how they question the assumptions they once trusted without hesitation. For the victim's family, life does not return to normal because normal was lost long before the trial. What changes instead is the shape of the pain. It sharpens, then softens, then settles into something quieter but deeper. They visit the grave with new words to say, not because the loved one can hear them, but because silence no longer feels necessary. They speak the name of the person responsible, not with rage, but with finality. A chapter closed does not mean the book is finished. It means the story can finally be read without skipping pages. The man convicted now exists in a different world, one measured by sentences and schedules and steel doors. His past has caught up with him completely. The life he built after 1998 collapses into irrelevance under the weight of one night. He is no longer defined by his job or his address, but by a case number, by a DNA profile, by an act that refused to stay buried. Whether he reflects, regrets, or rationalizes no longer matters. The truth has already spoken for him, and it's spoken a language that cannot be argued with. Experts point to the case as a turning point, another example of how genealogy and technology are rewriting the rules of justice. Conferences reference it. Training manuals include it. It becomes proof of concept, evidence that persistence paired with progress can bend even the longest timelines. But behind every statistic is a human cost, and behind every success story is a reminder that these tools exist because the damage already happened. Advancement does not undo harm. It only changes how long harm can hide. Late one evening, long after the official work is done, a junior detective opens the case file on a screen, scrolling through scanned documents, photographs, transcripts.
To them, this is history.
To others, it was life. The detective pauses at a grainy image from the original scene, feeling the familiar chill, the same one that hooked investigators decades earlier. The lesson is clear and unsettling. No case is ever truly cold. It is either waiting or warning. Outside, the city continues its rhythm. Traffic lights change. Apartments glow and go dark. Somewhere, someone locks a door without knowing why they feel the urge to double-check it. Somewhere else, a family sleeps knowing a question that haunted them for years finally has an answer. The world does not stop for justice, but justice, when it arrives, leaves fingerprints everywhere. And so the story doesn't end with a solved cold case or a DNA breakthrough, even if that's how it's remembered. It ends in the spaces in between, in the knowledge carried forward, in the caution that lingers, in the understanding that time does not erase truth, it only delays it. The past waits. The evidence waits. And when the moment comes, when science and memory finally align, the silence breaks, not with a scream, but with a certainty that echoes long after the case is closed. Years later, when the case is mentioned only occasionally, usually in the context of progress or precedent, the emotional residue remains quietly active, like a low current beneath calm water. The file is archived now, labeled, indexed, digitally preserved, its journey officially complete, but its influence keeps moving outward, touching people who were never listed as witnesses, never interviewed, never called to testify. This is what cold cases do when they finally resolve. They don't end, they disperse, fragmenting into lessons, warnings, and memories that refuse to stay contained. In police academies, recruits hear the story without the fear that once defined it. They learn it as an example of patience, of evidence management, of why nothing gets thrown away no matter how insignificant it seems at the time. An instructor pauses on the year, 1998, and lets it hang in the air, reminding them that technology will always evolve faster than certainty, that today's dead end may become tomorrow's breakthrough. The room is quiet as the implication settles in. Every report they write might one day be reopened by someone they will never meet. The city itself has changed. New buildings stand where empty lots once held candlelight vigils. Streets have been renamed. Businesses have come and gone. To someone new, the place feels ordinary, almost forgettable. But beneath the asphalt and concrete, the memory persists, woven into the geography like a scar beneath healed skin. Longtime residents still orient themselves by the case, before it happened, after it was solved, because trauma has its own calendar, and resolution does not erase the way time was once divided. The victim's name surfaces now and then, usually in articles about justice delayed or forensic advancement. Each mention pulls the family briefly back into the spotlight, back into the role they never asked for. They respond with practiced restraint, careful not to let their grief become a spectacle again. They've learned that public closure and private healing are not the same thing. The verdict gave them answers, but living with those answers is a separate process, one that doesn't follow court schedules or media cycles. Investigators who worked the case find themselves thinking about it unexpectedly, while driving at night, while hearing an old song, while passing a street that looks just enough like the one in the photographs to trigger memory. They no longer feel the urgency they once did, but they feel something steadier, heavier. The knowledge that persistence matters, that effort accumulates even when it appears to fail, that justice can be delayed without being denied, but only if someone keeps the door open long enough for the truth to return. Technology continues to advance, databases expand, algorithms refine themselves, and with each improvement, the definition of unsolvable shrinks. Cold cases across the country begin to stir, names resurfacing, timelines reconnecting, long silent evidence finally finding a voice. This case becomes one of many, but it retains its weight because it arrived at the intersection of old pain and new possibility. It proved that the past is not fixed. It is searchable. And still, there are limits. No database can restore a life. No conviction can replace a future that never happened. The science is powerful, but it is not compassionate. Compassion belongs to the living, to the families who waited, to the communities that endured uncertainty, to the investigators who carried unanswered questions longer than they carried answers. The resolution of a cold case is not a triumph over tragedy. It is an acknowledgement of it. On quiet nights, when the city settles into its lowest register, there is a sense that the story has finally found its place. Not forgotten, not sensationalized, but integrated into the collective memory where it can exist without dominating. The fear has softened. The mystery has resolved. What remains is understanding, tempered by the awareness that certainty often arrives too late to feel clean or victorious. The final echo of this case is not the arrest, not the DNA match, not the verdict. It is the reminder left behind, subtle but unshakable, that time does not protect the guilty, that silence is not the same as absence, and that every unanswered question leaves a footprint somewhere, waiting for the moment when someone looks down and realizes it has been there all along. And so the voice fades, not with closure, but with continuity. The case rests, but vigilance does not. The past has spoken, but it is not done speaking. Somewhere, another file sits unopened. Somewhere, another name waits to be called. And when it is, when the silence breaks again, the story will remind us of this one, not as history, but as proof that even after decades, the truth has a way of finding its way back into the light. Even after everything has been said, even after the file has been sealed and the story has been told so many times it risks becoming familiar, there is a final unease that never fully settles. It lives in the awareness that this case, for all its resolution, was never an exception. It was a sample, one point of light in a much larger darkness. And once you understand that, once the weight of it sinks in, you realize the real disturbance isn't what happened in 1998, it's how easily it could have stayed hidden forever. The justice system moves on because it has to. New cases arrive daily, louder, fresher, demanding attention. Briefings replace briefings. Names replace names. But for those who understand the anatomy of this investigation, the solved cold case becomes a quiet reference point, an internal measure against which every new mystery is weighed. When a lead goes cold too quickly, they remember this one. When evidence seems insignificant, they remember this one. When time feels like an enemy, they remember that time can also be leverage. There is a subtle shift in how investigators talk about the past now. Less resignation, more patience. Cold cases are no longer described as forgotten or abandoned, but as paused. The language matters. Words shape expectations, and expectations shape effort. This case taught them that waiting does not mean surrender, that silence does not equal defeat. Somewhere between the crime scene tape and the DNA lab, the meaning of persistence was rewritten. In academic circles, the case is dissected with clinical precision. Charts, timelines, statistical models. Professors talk about probability curves and database growth, about how a single data point can collapse years of uncertainty. Students take notes, nodding, understanding the mechanics but not the cost. Because the cost doesn't show up in equations. It lives in the human margins, where families age while they wait, where fear becomes routine, where unanswered questions quietly rearrange entire lives. The city rarely speaks of it anymore, but it hasn't forgotten. Memory doesn't need conversation to survive. It stays embedded in habits, in the way people teach their children about safety, in the stories that surface late at night when the mood turns reflective. The solved case didn't erase the scar, it explained it. And explanation, while powerful, does not reverse damage. It only gives it a shape. Sometimes someone new stumbles across the story online. A late-night search. A recommendation algorithm pulling old news into the present. They read the headline, "Cold Case Solved, DNA Breakthrough," and feel a brief jolt of satisfaction. Justice served. Mystery ended. Then they read deeper. The dates stretch backward. The waiting becomes visible. The ending feels less triumphant and more complicated. They close the article with a different feeling than they expected, carrying the quiet realization that truth is not always kind in the way it arrives. The offender's name fades from relevance again, reduced to a footnote in legal databases, a cautionary entry in forensic history. What matters is not who he was, but what exposed him. A trace too small to notice. A system patient enough to keep it. A future that reached back and refused to let the past remain unresolved. In that sense, the case becomes less about one crime and more about inevitability, the idea that some actions create echoes that technology will eventually hear. Late one night, Long after the case has stopped being discussed, a single sentence from the original report is quoted in a training seminar. No suspects at this time. The room listens differently now. They understand the sentence not as failure, but as incompletion. A reminder that investigations do not always move forward in straight lines, that some truths take decades to mature, and that the absence of answers is not the same as the absence of truth. As the years continue to pass, this case will slowly lose its sharpness in the public mind. That's the nature of time. But its lesson will remain embedded in systems, in protocols, in the quiet confidence that evidence kept is evidence that can still speak. The voice of the past may weaken, distort, fade, but it does not disappear. And so the story stretches beyond its own ending, beyond verdicts and headlines, into something more enduring. Not closure, not comfort, but vigilance. A shared understanding that every cold case is a question still breathing, every unsolved file a conversation waiting to resume. The silence is never final. It is only the pause before the truth finds another way to be heard. By the time the case reaches its 15th retelling, it no longer feels like a single story, but like a long shadow cast across multiple generations. People who were children when it happened are adults now. Some don't remember the night itself, only the atmosphere that followed. The warnings whispered by parents, the tightened routines, the sense that something unseen had entered their world and never fully left. The solution came so late that it arrived in a different era, landing among people who had already learned to live with uncertainty as a permanent fixture. In the years after the conviction, the case becomes quieter, but not smaller. It slips into conversations about trust, about systems, about how societies carry unresolved harm. The solved cold case is no longer just about one victim or one offender. It becomes a reference point for how long fear can last when answers don't. Psychologists talk about communal trauma. Sociologists talk about memory. Investigators talk about patience. Each discipline pulls at a different thread, but they all lead back to the same truth. Unresolved violence doesn't end when the crime scene is cleared. It lingers until certainty replaces speculation. Some nights, the old neighborhood feels almost peaceful. The streetlights hum. Cars pass without slowing. New residents walk dogs past houses that once felt dangerous after dark. They don't know the details unless someone tells them. But even without knowledge, there is a residue in the place, a faint sense of history pressing up through the ordinary. Places remember what people try to forget. They absorb fear, hold it, release it slowly over time. The investigators who once chased this case are older now, some retired, some gone. Their voices exist only in transcripts and recordings, in statements read aloud by people who never met them. Yet their persistence remains tangible. Every preserved sample, every sealed envelope, every note taken instead of discarded was an act of faith in a future they might never see. The solution belongs as much to restraint as it does to innovation, the decision not to erase the past simply because it refused to explain itself right away. The family of the victim lives with a strange duality. The question that defined their lives for decades has been answered, but its answer does not fade into the background the way they once imagined it might. Knowing who did it does not quiet every doubt. It simply replaces one kind of noise with another. They move forward carefully, aware that grief does not obey logic. Still, there is something different now. A weight has shifted. The waiting is over. What remains is remembrance. In classrooms and seminars, the case is summarized in a few clean lines: year, crime, delay, DNA, arrest. The simplicity of the outline is deceptive. It hides the nights of fear, the rumors, the false leads, the years of silence. It hides the cost of not knowing. But for those paying close attention, the lesson is clear. Justice is not a moment. It is a process stretched across time, vulnerable to human limits, but strengthened by human refusal to let go. Technology will continue to evolve. Databases will grow. Algorithms will sharpen. More names will emerge from the dark. But this case will always stand as a reminder that progress does not arrive all at once. It arrives in fragments, sometimes decades apart, sometimes too late to feel triumphant. And yet, Even delayed truth has power. It redraws the past. It reframes memory. It proves that silence is not safety for those who believe time will protect them. As the years pass, the phrase cold case itself begins to change meaning. It no longer suggests abandonment. It suggests dormancy, a state of waiting rather than forgetting. This case helped redefine that idea, not through hope, but through proof. Proof that the past is not inert. Proof that evidence has endurance. Proof that some stories do not end when we stop listening to them. And in the quiet that follows, after the last article is archived and the last seminar ends, the case settles into its final form, not as a mystery, not as a headline, but as a warning carried forward. A reminder that time does not erase responsibility, that unanswered questions leave traces, and that even after decades of darkness, the truth can still rise, slowly, relentlessly, into the light. At a certain distance, the case stops feeling like news and starts feeling like weather, something that shaped the environment quietly, persistently, without asking for attention. People don't talk about it every day anymore, but it influenced the way they built their lives, the way institutions adjusted their practices, the way trust was recalibrated inch by inch. The cold case, once a wound, became a pressure system, altering behavior long after the storm itself passed. For law enforcement, its legacy is embedded in routine. Evidence retention policies tightened. Old boxes were re-examined, not with urgency, but with respect. There is a different tone now when someone suggests a case might be unsolvable. Less certainty, more restraint. This story taught them that unsolved is not a verdict, it's a condition. Temporary, reversible, dependent on what the future is willing to offer in return for patience. The victim's name no longer appears in breaking news banners, but it exists in quieter places. On memorial plaques, in private conversations, in the pauses people take when similar stories surface. The person is remembered not only for how they died, but for how long they were waited for. That waiting became a form of love, stretched across decades, carried by people who refused to let absence become erasure. Somewhere deep in a database, the DNA profile remains stored, no longer anonymous, no longer a question. It sits among millions of others, silent now. Its work done. It doesn't celebrate. It doesn't regret. It simply exists as proof that truth can survive neglect, that even the smallest biological trace can outlast denial, distance, and time. Science did not solve the case alone, but it made forgetting impossible. The offender fades further into obscurity, stripped of narrative power. There are no myths left to build around him, no unanswered questions to inflate his presence. He is reduced to fact, to record, to consequence. That reduction is its own form of justice. The story was never meant to belong to him, and in the end, it doesn't. For those who follow the case closely, there is a lingering vigilance, a sharpened awareness that silence is rarely empty, that gaps in stories often mean something is still moving beneath the surface. They listen differently now to headlines, to rumors, to the quiet spaces where details don't quite align. The solved cold case did not make them feel safer. It made them more attentive. Years from now, someone will come across the case for the first time, maybe through an archive, maybe through a late-night recommendation, maybe through a passing reference in a documentary. They'll read it quickly, absorbing decades in minutes, and move on. But a few will pause. A few will feel the weight behind the words. Those are the ones the story is really for, the ones who understand that resolution does not mean relief, and that answers do not always heal, but they do matter. The final impact of the case is not dramatic. It is subtle. It exists in changed procedures, in quieter confidence, in the collective understanding that time is not an accomplice. It is a witness. A slow one. An imperfect one. But a witness all the same. And when the story finally settles into its longest silence, it does so without disappearing. It remains as a low, steady reminder that no matter how cold a case becomes, it is still alive somewhere, waiting in evidence, waiting in memory, waiting in the future for the moment when someone, something, finally knows how to listen.